Have you ever heard of a wrestler so talented that legends believed he could have been a superstar, yet so haunted by his personal battles that his name almost disappeared from wrestling history? In an industry built on larger-than-life heroes and unforgettable villains, Chris Colt became something far more tragic, a man whose greatest opponent was never inside the wrestling ring. His story isn't just about professional wrestling, it's about fame, identity, addiction, and the devastating cost of trying to survive in a world that demanded you hide who you truly were. Today we're diving deep into Dark Side of the Ring Season 5, Episode 6, Chris Colt. Welcome to my nightmare. To uncover the remarkable rise and heartbreaking fall of one of wrestling's most fascinating forgotten figures. Before we begin, it's important to remember that this video discusses historical events involving addiction, discrimination, illness, and death. The goal is to examine these events respectfully and understand the real human story behind them, while honoring the people whose lives were affected. Professional wrestling during the 1970s and early 1980s was unlike the global entertainment machine fans know today. Long before billion-dollar television deals and social media transformed the business, wrestling operated through a system of regional territories spread across North America. Every territory had its own stars, promoters, and loyal audiences. Wrestlers spent countless hours driving from town to town, performing night after night, while constantly trying to impress promoters who controlled the next opportunity. Success required more than athletic ability. It demanded charisma, toughness, creativity, and an almost unbelievable level of mental endurance. Into that world stepped Chris Colt. Even if you've followed wrestling for decades, there's a good chance you've never heard his name. That's exactly why his story is so compelling. Colt wasn't forgotten because he lacked talent. In fact, many people who worked alongside him believed the complete opposite. They saw someone with natural charisma, an impressive physique, and a personality capable of captivating an audience the moment he walked through the curtain. He had confidence, style, and an ability to make fans react whether they loved him or hated him. Those qualities are incredibly difficult to teach. Wrestling trainers can improve technique, but genuine charisma is something very few performers possess. Chris Colt seemed to have it naturally. What made him even more unique was his willingness to reinvent himself. Throughout his career, Colt experimented with different looks, characters, and presentation styles. At a time when many wrestlers relied on one established gimmick for years, he constantly searched for ways to stand out. Some promoters admired that creativity. Others viewed it as unpredictability. In wrestling, being memorable is valuable, but being considered unreliable can quickly become a career-ending reputation. Unfortunately for Colt, unpredictability slowly became one of the defining themes of his life. Dark Side of the Ring paints a picture of someone who lived at full speed. Friends and colleagues describe him as intelligent, funny, charming, and endlessly entertaining. But beneath that charisma existed struggles that few people truly understood. His life increasingly became a series of emotional highs and devastating lows. One of the biggest challenges Colt faced had nothing to do with wrestling itself. He was a gay man working in an industry where masculinity was often exaggerated and rigid expectations dominated the locker room. During that era, openly identifying as gay could destroy a wrestling career almost overnight. Prejudice was widespread throughout much of society, and professional wrestling reflected many of those same attitudes. For someone trying to build a career, revealing such a personal truth carried enormous professional risks. Because of that environment, Colt lived much of his life behind carefully constructed walls. He wasn't simply performing inside the wrestling ring. He was performing in everyday life as well, constantly managing what people knew about him and what remained hidden. It's difficult to imagine the emotional weight of maintaining that kind of secrecy year after year. Every new territory meant meeting new coworkers. Every interview meant carefully choosing words. Every friendship required deciding how much of himself he could safely reveal. The documentary suggests that this constant pressure became another burden added to an already complicated life. As the years passed, another destructive force entered the picture: substance abuse. The wrestling business of that period was physically brutal. Pain was considered part of the job. Many performers relied on alcohol or drugs to cope with injuries, stress, exhaustion, and the relentless travel schedule. While every wrestler's experience was different, addiction became an unfortunate reality for many people throughout the industry. Chris Colt was no exception. Accounts from people who knew him describe increasingly erratic behavior. Stories circulated about excessive drug use, unpredictable decisions, and incidents that left promoters questioning whether they could depend on him. Some stories became almost legendary, passed around wrestling circles for years. While it's important to recognize that memories can become exaggerated over time, the overall pattern remains consistent. Colt's struggles were becoming impossible to ignore. This created a painful contradiction. When he was focused and healthy, many believed he possessed the ability to become a major attraction. But wrestling is built on consistency. Promoters need performers who arrive on time, complete scheduled appearances, and represent their companies professionally. Even extraordinary talent can be overshadowed if reliability becomes uncertain. As opportunities disappeared, the downward spiral accelerated. The episode also explores another aspect of Colt's life that remained largely hidden from wrestling audiences for years. During periods when wrestling work became inconsistent, he sought income elsewhere, including appearances in adult films under different names. In today's world, conversations surrounding sexuality and personal identity are often more open than they were decades ago. At that time, however, such work carried significant social stigma and could have permanently damaged a wrestler's career if widely known. For Colt, this wasn't simply about making controversial choices. It reflected the complicated daily of someone trying to survive financially while navigating a society that often left him with limited opportunities. That context matters. Looking back through modern eyes, it's easy to judge individual decisions without understanding the environment in which they were made. Dark Side of the Ring encourages viewers to see the broader picture, a man facing multiple forms of pressure simultaneously, each one making the others even harder to overcome. One of the documentary's greatest strengths is that it refuses to reduce Chris Colt to a collection of shocking headlines. Instead, it introduces viewers to family members, friends, historians, and wrestling personalities who remember not only the chaos, but also the kindness. They describe someone who could light up a room with humor, inspire people with his creativity, and leave a lasting impression on almost everyone he met. That's what makes this story especially heartbreaking. The more you learn about Chris Colt, the more you realize this isn't simply the story of another wrestler whose career went off track. It's the story of extraordinary potential repeatedly colliding with personal pain. And unfortunately, the darkest chapter of his life was still ahead. As his addiction worsened, his professional opportunities became increasingly scarce. Friends who once saw limitless promise began watching someone they cared about slip further away. The wrestling world moved on to its next generation of stars, while Chris Colt found himself fighting battles that could no longer be solved with talent alone. By the late 1980s, the wrestling industry was changing rapidly. Regional territories that had once provided steady work for countless wrestlers were disappearing as national promotions expanded their reach. Competition became fiercer than ever, and only a small percentage of performers managed to secure consistent contracts. For someone already struggling with addiction, financial instability, and personal challenges, those changes made survival even more difficult. Chris Colt was one of the many talented wrestlers caught in that transition. But unlike others, he was carrying burdens that extended far beyond the business itself. As Dark Side of the Ring explains, Colt's professional opportunities continued to shrink. Promoters who had once admired his charisma became increasingly hesitant to book him. Wrestling is an industry built on trust. A promoter needs confidence that a performer will arrive on time, be physically able to compete, and work safely with opponents. When concerns about reliability begin to outweigh talent, opportunities quickly disappear. For Chris Colt, this became a devastating cycle. Fewer bookings meant less income. Less income created greater stress. Greater stress often made addiction even harder to overcome. Each problem fed into the next, until escaping that cycle became incredibly difficult. One of the most powerful aspects of this episode is that it never suggests there was a single reason Chris Colt's life unraveled. Instead, it shows how multiple factors slowly collided over many years. Addiction alone didn't define his story. Neither did discrimination, financial hardship, or mental health struggles. It was the combination of all these pressures that gradually overwhelmed someone who had once seemed destined for far greater success. As viewers, it's tempting to search for one turning point, the moment when everything changed. But real life is rarely that simple. Most tragedies develop gradually, through hundreds of small setbacks, missed opportunities, difficult decisions, and circumstances that become harder to reverse with time. The documentary also reminds us that wrestling fans often only see what happens inside the ring. They cheer the entrances, celebrate championship victories, and remember unforgettable rivalries. What they don't see are the lonely hotel rooms, endless road trips, chronic pain, financial uncertainty, and emotional pressure that many performers experience behind the scenes. Chris Colt's life is a powerful example of that hidden reality. As the years passed, he became increasingly isolated from the wrestling world that had once offered him hope. Friends remembered seeing flashes of the same funny, intelligent, and charismatic man they had always known, but those moments became less frequent. The person who could once command an audience now found himself struggling simply to keep his own life together. The episode also explores the devastating impact of the AIDS epidemic during the 1980s and early 1990s. At that time, fear and misinformation were widespread. Many people living with HIV or AIDS faced enormous stigma in addition to their medical challenges. Public understanding was limited, and countless individuals suffered discrimination alongside serious illness. According to those interviewed in the documentary, Chris Colt's health continued to decline during this period. His personal struggles, combined with addiction and deteriorating physical condition, made rebuilding his life increasingly difficult. Rather than receiving widespread support, he often found himself alone. Eventually, reports indicate that Colt experienced periods of homelessness, a heartbreaking reality for someone who had once entertained thousands of fans across North America. It's one of the most painful contrasts presented in the episode. The same performer who once stood beneath bright arena lights was now living largely out of public view, his contributions to wrestling fading from memory while he fought battles that few people even knew existed. Chris Colt died in 1995, at only 45 years old. His passing marked the end of a life filled with enormous promise, unforgettable charisma, and profound personal hardship. While the exact details surrounding his final years remain incomplete, the documentary makes one thing abundantly clear. This was not simply the story of a wrestler who failed. It was the story of a human being who faced extraordinary challenges during a period when understanding, acceptance, and support were often painfully limited. That perspective is what separates this episode from many other wrestling documentaries. Instead of focusing primarily on backstage scandals or shocking controversies, Dark Side of the Ring asks viewers to look beyond the headlines. It encourages us to see Chris Colt not as a cautionary tale defined by addiction or controversy, but as a gifted performer whose life reflected many of the social realities of his era. One of the episode's greatest strengths is its balance. It doesn't ignore Colt's mistakes, nor does it excuse them. Addiction caused real consequences. His behavior sometimes damaged relationships and professional opportunities. Those facts remain part of his story. At the same time, the documentary refuses to reduce him to those mistakes alone. Friends, family members, wrestling historians, and colleagues remember someone who could be generous, creative, hilarious, and deeply compassionate. They describe a man who loved entertaining audiences and who possessed a natural ability to connect with people when he was at his best. Those memories matter because they remind us that every public figure is more complicated than a list of career highlights or personal failures. In many ways, Chris Colt's story also reflects how much society has changed. Today's wrestling industry is far from perfect, but conversations surrounding mental health, addiction recovery, and LGBTQ+ inclusion are far more common than they were during Colt's career. More organizations now recognize the importance of providing support systems for performers dealing with personal challenges. While progress is ongoing, it's difficult to imagine Chris Colt receiving exactly the same response if he were beginning his career today. That doesn't erase what happened, but it highlights why remembering stories like his remains important. History isn't valuable simply because it tells us what happened. It's valuable because it helps us understand why those events happened and what lessons can be learned moving forward. Watching this episode, it's impossible not to wonder what Chris Colt might have accomplished under different circumstances. With his charisma, confidence, and undeniable talent, could he have become a nationally recognized star? Could better support, greater acceptance, or earlier treatment have changed the course of his life? No documentary can answer those questions with certainty, but asking them reminds us that behind every wrestling persona is a real person navigating challenges that audiences rarely see. Ultimately, Chris Colt, Welcome to My Nightmare, is less about professional wrestling than it is about resilience, identity, and compassion. It tells the story of a man who dreamed of becoming a star, but found himself fighting battles that no championship could solve. It reminds us that talent alone cannot overcome addiction, prejudice, or isolation without meaningful support. For wrestling fans, this episode shines a light on one of the industry's most overlooked figures. For everyone else, it serves as a powerful reminder that success and suffering can exist side by side, often hidden behind a smile, a performance, or a larger-than-life character. Chris Colt may never have reached the level of fame enjoyed by wrestling's biggest icons, but perhaps that's exactly why his story deserves to be remembered. It gives a voice to someone history nearly forgot, and challenges us to see the human being behind the performer. If there's one lasting message from this episode, it's this. Every legend has a story. Every performer carries unseen struggles, and sometimes the most important stories in wrestling aren't about championships or victories. They're about the people whose lives remind us why empathy matters. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Dark Side of the Ring, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more wrestling documentaries and analysis, and let me know in the comments which episode you'd like us to explore next. Wrestling history is filled with incredible stories, but the ones that stay with us the longest are often the ones that reveal the very human lives behind the spotlight. Until next time, thanks for watching, and take care.